The hole in the wall was barely 1 inch square, but through it, Harriet Jacobs could see everything. She watched her daughter Louisa play in the yard below, picking flowers and laughing with the innocence that only a 7-year-old could possess. The child had no idea that her mother was 15 feet above her head, lying in a coffin-sized crawl space where she could neither stand nor turn around. Harriet pressed her eye against the tiny opening she had bored into the wood with a gimlet, drinking in the sight of her child like a woman dying of thirst. She had been in this attic for 3 years. She would be here for 4 more. The space measured exactly 9 feet by 7 feet, with a sloping roof that reached just 3 feet at its highest point. Harriet could not stand. She could not sit upright. She could only lie on her side or crouch in a position that sent screaming pain through her legs after the first hour. In summer, the North Carolina heat turned the crawl space into an oven that baked her flesh and made breathing feel like swallowing fire. In winter, the cold crept through every crack, freezing her limbs until she could not feel her fingers for days at a time. Mice and rats shared her prison, scurrying across her body in the darkness, and she had long since stopped flinching at their touch. But this torture was freedom compared to what waited below. Dr. James Norcom had made that perfectly clear from the moment she turned 15 years old. He had whispered his intentions into her ear with breath that smelled of brandy and entitlement. He had built her a cottage 4 miles from town where his wife's jealous eyes could not follow. He had told her, in words that left no room for misunderstanding, that her body belonged to him by law, by custom, and by the simple fact that he owned the paper that said she was his property. Harriet had chosen this coffin instead. She had chosen 7 years of physical agony, of watching her children grow through a peephole, of listening to their voices call for a mother who could not answer. She had chosen permanent damage to her body, disease, isolation, and the very real possibility of death in this darkness over submitting to the man who claimed ownership of her flesh. Through her peephole, she watched Louisa drop her flowers and run toward something Harriet could not see. The girl's laughter floated up to the attic, and Harriet felt tears slide down her cheeks into the rough planks beneath her face. She had not held her daughter in 3 years. She would not hold her for 4 more. But Louisa would grow up not knowing the cottage Dr. Norcom had built. She would not know the weight of his hand on the back of her neck or the sound of his breathing in her ear. She would not become what he had tried to make Harriet become. That was worth any price, even this one. But the story of how Harriet Jacobs came to choose a 7-year imprisonment over sexual submission begins long before the day she climbed into that crawl space. And understanding it requires understanding exactly what slavery meant for a young woman who possessed beauty that drew dangerous attention, intelligence that made her too aware of her situation, and a grandmother who had taught her that some things were worth more than survival. This is not fiction. What you just heard is documented in historical records, verified by multiple primary sources. Unlike storytelling channels that fabricate tales, every detail in this video comes from authenticated narratives, court documents, and eyewitness testimonies, preserved in historical archives. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button, because real history is more incredible than any fiction could ever be. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Harriet Ann Jacobs was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina, in 1813, though she would not understand what that meant until her mother died when she was 6 years old. Until that moment, Harriet had lived in a kind of privileged ignorance that some slave children experienced when their masters chose to treat them almost like family, a cruel kindness that made the later realization of their true status all the more devastating. Her mother, Delilah, had been a house slave in the Horniblow family, and her father, Daniel, was a skilled carpenter whose expertise earned him respect even from white artisans, who would never acknowledge him as an equal. Harriet's early childhood was spent in relative comfort, sheltered from the worst brutalities of slavery by parents who worked hard to create a bubble of safety around their children. She played with white children as if status did not exist. She ate good food. She wore clean clothes. And she had no idea that the people she called master and mistress believed they owned her body and soul. Her mother's death shattered that illusion with the casual cruelty that characterized slavery's every interaction. Delilah had served her mistress, Margaret Horniblow, faithfully for decades, nursing her through illness and caring for her household with the devotion that enslaved people often gave to masters who treated them marginally better than the worst alternative. When Delilah died, Margaret Horniblow promised to care for young Harriet, and for a time, she bore up that promise. She taught Harriet to read and write, skills that were forbidden to slaves in North Carolina, and that would later save Harriet's life and sanity. She allowed Harriet to maintain connections with her father and her grandmother Molly, who had purchased her own freedom years earlier and ran a small bakery in Edenton. But when Margaret Horniblow died in 1825, Harriet was 12 years old and about to discover that the law regarded her not as a grieving child who had lost a second mother, but as property to be disposed of according to the deceased's will. Margaret Horniblow had bequeathed Harriet not to her own family members, who might have continued treating her kindly, but to her 3-year-old niece, Mary Matilda Norcom. And Mary's father was Dr. James Norcom, a respected physician in Edenton, whose professional reputation masked appetites that would make him Harriet's nightmare for the next decade. Dr. Norcom was 52 years old when 12-year-old Harriet entered his household. He was married to a woman named Maria, who knew exactly what kind of man she had wed, and who dealt with that knowledge through a fury that she directed not at her husband, but at the enslaved women he targeted. The Norcom household was a place of constant tension, where Maria's jealous rage collided with James's predatory entitlement, and the enslaved people caught between them suffered consequences from both sides. For the first few years, Harriet's youth provided some protection. Dr. Norcom watched her with interest that grew more intense as she matured, but he did not act immediately on his intentions. He was a patient man, and he understood that timing mattered. He needed to isolate Harriet from her grandmother's protection, to break down her resistance gradually, to make her understand that submission was inevitable. He began his campaign with words. When Harriet turned 15, Dr. Norcom started whispering to her. He would find moments when they were alone in the house, moments he carefully created, and he would stand close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and the pomade in his hair. He would tell her things that made her face burn with shame and confusion. He would describe what he wanted to do to her in language that mixed medical terminology with crude desire. He would remind her that she belonged to his daughter, which meant she belonged to him, and that resistance was both futile and dangerous. Harriet had been raised by a grandmother who had bought her own freedom and who maintained her dignity despite having lived as a slave for 50 years. Molly Horniblow had taught her granddaughter that submission was not the only option, that intelligence and determination could sometimes overcome circumstances that appeared hopeless. When Harriet told her grandmother about Dr. Norcom's words, Molly's response was unequivocal. She would not submit. Molly would find a way to buy Harriet's freedom. They would endure until that became possible. But Dr. Norcom had no intention of selling Harriet. The law gave him absolute power over her, and he had decided that he would exercise that power in full. When his whispered promises failed to break Harriet's resistance, he escalated his tactics. He began touching her, casual contact that he could explain away if challenged, but that carried unmistakable sexual intent. A hand on her shoulder that slid down her back. Fingers that lingered too long when passing her an object. Embraces that he claimed were paternal, but that pressed his body against hers in ways that fathers did not touch daughters. Maria Norcom understood exactly what was happening, but her response was not to constrain her husband's behavior. Instead, she turned her fury on Harriet, treating the teenage girl as if she were a rival for her husband's affections rather than a victim of his predation. She watched Harriet constantly, looking for any excuse to accuse her of improper behavior. She assigned her the hardest, most degrading tasks. She struck her without warning or provocation, and she reminded her daily that she was property with no rights, no dignity, and no protection from any treatment the Norcom family chose to inflict. The psychological torture of living between James Norcom's sexual harassment and Maria Norcom's physical abuse created an environment where Harriet existed in constant terror. She could not sleep without fear that Dr. Norcom would enter her room. She could not work without anxiety that Maria Norcom would find fault and punish her. She could not find a moment of peace in a house where every corner held threat and every day brought fresh humiliation. When Harriet was 16, she fell in love with a free black carpenter who wanted to marry her. His name has been lost to history, but his importance to Harriet's story is immeasurable. He represented the possibility of escape through legitimate means. If Dr. Norcom would consent to sell her, this man could purchase her freedom, and they could marry and build a life together. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only legal path to freedom that Harriet could envision. Dr. Norcom's response to Harriet's request for permission to marry revealed the full extent of his possessiveness and his determination to break her spirit. He refused absolutely, and his refusal came with violence that left Harriet bleeding and bruised. He told her that she would never marry anyone, that she belonged to him, that her future held only submission or suffering. He then proceeded to make that suffering as comprehensive as possible. He announced his plan to build a cottage for Harriet 4 miles outside of Edenton, far from her grandmother's protective presence, and from the eyes of neighbors who might witness what happened there. The cottage's purpose was transparent. It would be a place where he could visit Harriet without his wife's knowledge, where he could finally force the submission that she had refused to give voluntarily. He began construction immediately, describing to Harriet in explicit detail what would happen once the cottage was complete. Harriet understood that she had reached a crisis point. Once Dr. Norcom moved her to that isolated cottage, she would have no defense against his assault. Her grandmother could not protect her. The law would not protect her. No white person in Edenton would care that a 55-year-old doctor was raping his teenage slave. And once Norcom had accomplished his purpose, Harriet's life would become an endless repetition of abuse that would destroy not just her body, but her spirit. In her desperation, Harriet made a decision that shocked her grandmother and scandalized everyone who later learned of it. She deliberately began a sexual relationship with a white lawyer named Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. Her reasoning was coldly strategic. If she became pregnant by Sawyer, Dr. Norcom might be so enraged that he would sell her out of spite, and Sawyer had promised to purchase her and any children she bore and grant them freedom. It was a plan born of desperation, a calculation that trading submission to one man might save her from submission to another, and that any action was better than the passive acceptance of Norcom's intentions. The affair with Sawyer lasted several years and produced 2 children, a son named Joseph, born in 1829, and a daughter named Louisa Matilda, born in 1833. Harriet's pregnancy did indeed enrage Dr. Norcom, but not in the way she had hoped. Rather than selling her, he became even more determined to assert his ownership. He subjected her to violent beatings. He accused her of being a whore and promised that her children would be sold away from her as soon as they were old enough. He moved her to his plantation outside Edenton and assigned her to work in the fields under brutal conditions designed to break her spirit through physical exhaustion. But pregnancy and motherhood had transformed Harriet's motivations. Before her children's birth, she had been trying to save herself. Now she was trying to save them. The thought of her babies growing up under Dr. Norcom's control, of her daughter eventually suffering the same sexual predation that Harriet had endured, of her son being whipped and broken by overseers who saw him as less than human. These thoughts drove Harriet to contemplate actions that she had once considered impossible. In June 1835, Dr. Norcom issued an ultimatum that forced Harriet's hand. He told her that he was moving her and the children to his plantation permanently, that they would work in the fields until they died, or until Harriet agreed to submit to him, and that he would personally ensure that her daughter grew up to serve his pleasure just as he had intended for Harriet to do. It was a threat calculated to destroy any remaining resistance, but it had the opposite effect. Harriet decided that if she could not save herself through submission, she would save herself and her children through escape. But escape for a young mother with 2 small children was nearly impossible. The network known as the Underground Railroad did not extend effectively into the Deep South in 1835. Harriet had no money, no documentation, and no way to travel north without being captured. Simply running away would result in her being caught within days and returned to Dr. Norcom, who would then carry out his threats against her children. She needed a plan that would protect not just her freedom, but theirs as well. Harriet's strategy was remarkable for its psychological sophistication. She understood Dr. Norcom well enough to know that his desire to own her was mixed with his fury at her resistance. If she disappeared, but appeared to have escaped to the north, Norcom's pride would demand that he pursue her. But if he was chasing her in the wrong direction, he would not be watching her children. And if he believed the children were more valuable to him as leverage than as field hands, he might be willing to sell them to someone who would treat them better. Harriet's plan required her to hide somewhere close to Edenton, while making Norcom believe she had fled north. She enlisted the help of a sympathetic white woman who risked severe penalties to shelter Harriet in her home for several weeks. During this time, Harriet arranged for letters to be sent from northern cities, letters addressed to her grandmother that contained hints about where Harriet was supposedly hiding. Dr. Norcom received copies of these letters and immediately focused his search efforts in the wrong direction. But Harriet could not remain in the white woman's house indefinitely. The risk to her benefactor was too great, and Norcom's search of Edenton was becoming more intense. After several weeks, Harriet had to leave her temporary refuge and find a more permanent hiding place. For a brief time, she hid in a swamp near Edenton, living among snakes and enduring mosquito swarms that left her body covered in infected bites. She developed a fever that nearly killed her, and she realized that she could not survive long in the swamp. Her grandmother Molly offered the only solution that might work long-term. Molly's house on King Street included a small shed that had been built off the back of the main structure. Above the shed was a crawl space that had been created when the roof was added. The space was barely large enough for a human body and had no proper entrance. Molly's son would need to create a trap door in the ceiling of the shed to allow access. But once Harriet was inside, No one would suspect she was there. Dr. Norcom had already searched Molly's house twice looking for Harriet. He would not think to look in an attic crawlspace too small to appear habitable. In late June 1835, feverish and desperate, Harriet climbed through the trap door into the space that would be her home for the next 6 years and 11 months. The measurements were exact: 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 3 feet high at its tallest point, where the sloping roof met the outer wall. There was no window, no ventilation, and no light. Harriet lay on the rough wooden planks in absolute darkness and listened to her children playing in the yard below, so close she could hear their voices clearly, but unable to call out to them or hold them. The physical conditions in the crawlspace were brutal beyond description. In summer, the North Carolina heat turned the attic into an oven. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees, and there was no air circulation to provide relief. Harriet would lie motionless in the darkness, feeling sweat pour from her body and soak into the wooden planks, breathing air so hot and stagnant that it felt like drowning. She developed heat sickness regularly, vomiting until there was nothing left in her stomach, and then dry heaving while her body trembled with fever. In winter, the cold was equally devastating. The crawlspace had no insulation, and the North Carolina winters, while not as severe as northern cold, were more than sufficient to cause hypothermia in someone lying motionless in an unheated attic. Harriet would wrap herself in the few blankets her grandmother could sneak to her, but her body heat was insufficient to warm the space, and the cold would creep into her bones until she could not stop shaking. Her fingers and toes developed frostbite. She lost feeling in her limbs for days at a time. She wondered if she would wake up one morning to find that the cold had killed her in her sleep. The inability to move was perhaps the worst torture. A space 3 feet high at its maximum did not allow standing or even sitting upright. Harriet could only lie on her side or crouch in a position that sent agonizing pain through her legs, back, and neck after even short periods. The human body is not designed to remain in one position for months, let alone years. Harriet's muscles began to atrophy. Her joints stiffened. Her spine developed curvature problems that would plague her for the rest of her life. When she tried to shift position to relieve the pain in one set of muscles, she would trigger even worse pain in another set. The psychological torture matched the physical suffering. Harriet could hear everything happening in her grandmother's house below. She could hear her children's voices as they played, as they cried, as they asked where their mother was. Molly had told Joseph and Louisa that their mother had run away to the north, that she had escaped to freedom and would one day send for them. The children believed this story, and Harriet had to listen to them talk about her as if she were far away when she was 15 feet above their heads. The temptation to call out to them was nearly unbearable. There were moments when Joseph would cry for his mother in a way that tore at Harriet's heart, and she would have to press her hands over her mouth to keep from shouting that she was there, that she had not abandoned them, that she was watching over them even if they could not see her. But revealing her presence would destroy everything. Dr. Norcom would be informed immediately, and Harriet would be dragged from the attic back to his control. Everything she had endured would be for nothing. After several months in the crawlspace, Harriet realized that she would die without some access to light and fresh air. The complete darkness was causing her to lose her sense of time and space. The stagnant air was making her sick. She needed to see the sky, to breathe air that did not taste like dust and decay, to have some connection with the world outside her prison. Using a gimlet that her grandmother smuggled to her, Harriet spent weeks boring tiny holes through the wooden wall of the attic. She worked slowly and quietly, aware that any unusual noise might attract attention. The wood was hard and the gimlet was dull, and her hands cramped from the repeated motion. But eventually, she created several holes, each about an inch in diameter, that allowed narrow shafts of light to enter the crawl space. More importantly, they allowed her to see outside. Through these holes, Harriet watched the world continue without her. She watched her children grow from toddlers to children. She watched the seasons change, the garden bloom and die, and bloom again. She watched her grandmother walk to her bakery every morning and return every evening. She watched neighbors pass by on the street. She watched the life she had been forced to abandon continue as if she had never existed. The holes also allowed her to read. Her grandmother would leave newspapers and the family Bible in positions where Harriet could see them through her peepholes, and Harriet would press her face against the rough wood for hours, straining her eyes to make out the printed words in the dim light. Reading became her connection to humanity, her reminder that a world existed beyond the 9-by-7-foot darkness where her body was imprisoned. She read everything her grandmother could provide: newspapers that told her about political developments and the growing abolitionist movement, Bible passages that either gave her comfort or filled her with rage at a God who allowed such suffering, advertisements that showed her a world of commerce and prosperity that might as well have existed on another planet. Dr. Norcom's response to Harriet's disappearance was exactly what she had predicted. His pride could not accept that his property had escaped his control. He spent enormous amounts of time and money searching for her, traveling to New York and Boston, following up on rumors that Harriet had been spotted in those cities. He never suspected that she was still in Edenton, hidden in the last place he would think to look. His obsession with finding her became a joke among some Edenton residents, who wondered why the respected doctor devoted so much energy to recapturing one escaped slave when he owned dozens of others. But Norcom's obsession was not really about economics, or even about retrieving property. It was about asserting his dominance over a woman who had dared to refuse him. He had promised to possess Harriet, and her escape represented a defeat that his ego could not tolerate. He would spend the rest of his life trying to find her, long after it made any financial sense, driven by fury at the one slave who had escaped his control. Harriet's plan to protect her children through her disappearance worked better than she could have hoped. Dr. Norcom, enraged by Harriet's escape and hoping to lure her out of hiding, arranged to sell Joseph and Louisa to a slave trader who would supposedly take them to another state. But the slave trader was secretly working with Samuel Sawyer, who purchased his own children and arranged for them to live with Harriet's grandmother. Sawyer had promised to legally manumit them, though he would delay fulfilling that promise for years. Still, living with their great-grandmother was far better than the alternative Norcom had threatened. Harriet could watch her children through her peepholes now, could see them playing in the yard just below her hiding place. The torture of being so close to them without being able to hold them was exquisite. She would lie in the darkness after they had gone to bed and remember what it felt like to embrace them, to smell their hair, to hear their laughter directed at her instead of at someone else. She would imagine scenarios where she could climb down from the attic and spend just 1 hour with them. But she knew that indulging such fantasies would only make her suffering worse. Years passed with agonizing slowness. Harriet developed various health problems from her confinement: chronic pain in her legs and back, vision problems from reading in dim light, respiratory issues from breathing stale air, and psychological symptoms that might today be recognized as severe depression and PTSD. She contemplated suicide regularly, considering whether death might be preferable to this living entombment. What kept her alive was the knowledge that her children were safe, as long as Dr. Norcom believed she was in the North, and that if she died, Norcom might eventually realize where she had been hiding and intensify his watch on her grandmother's household. In 1838, Samuel Sawyer married a white woman and needed to distance himself from his illegitimate mixed-race children. He arranged to send Louisa to live with his relatives in Brooklyn, New York, where slavery had been abolished. He suggested doing the same for Joseph. Harriet, hidden in her attic prison, had to make one of the most difficult decisions of her life. Allowing her children to go north meant they would be truly free, beyond Dr. Norcom's reach, even if he somehow discovered the truth about their whereabouts. But it also meant Harriet would not see them again for years, perhaps never if her escape plan failed, or if she died in the attic. She gave her approval through her grandmother, and she watched through her peephole as her daughter prepared to leave for New York. Louisa was 7 years old and did not remember her mother clearly. She asked her great-grandmother Molly if her mother would be in New York, and Molly had to lie and say that perhaps someday Harriet would join her there. Harriet watched the carriage take her daughter away and wondered if she had made the right choice, if freedom far away was better than proximity while enslaved. Joseph remained in Edenton for another year before Sawyer sent him north as well. Harriet watched her son, now 10 years old, already showing signs of the man he would become, leave for a life of freedom that she had purchased with years of her own imprisonment. She was alone now in her crawl space, her children safe, but gone. Her purpose accomplished, but her prison continuing. The question became, what now? Harriet had hidden in the attic to protect her children from Dr. Norcom. With them safely in the north, she could attempt her own escape. But 7 years in the crawl space had destroyed her health. Her legs barely functioned after years without proper exercise. Her vision was damaged. Her overall physical condition was so poor that the trip north might kill her, even if she avoided capture. She had to regain some level of physical function before escape would be possible. Over the following months, Harriet began attempting to exercise in the tiny space. She would force herself to move her legs, to stretch her atrophied muscles, to rebuild some small portion of the physical capacity that imprisonment had destroyed. The pain was incredible. Muscles that had been inactive for years screamed in protest when she tried to use them. But Harriet had endured worse than physical pain. She forced herself through the exercises daily, building up slowly toward the possibility of escape. In 1842, 7 years after climbing into the crawl space, Harriet learned that a ship captain who was sympathetic to escaped slaves would be willing to take her north. The opportunity might not come again. Despite her poor physical condition, despite the risks, despite the terror of leaving the only protection she had known for 7 years, Harriet decided to make the attempt. Her escape from the attic happened at night, when darkness could conceal her movements. Her grandmother and uncle helped her climb down through the trap door, but Harriet's legs barely supported her weight. 7 years without standing had left her unable to walk normally. Her uncle had to carry her part of the way to the docks, where the ship captain was waiting. The journey north was a blur of pain and fear. Harriet was hidden in the ship's hold, cramped in a space that reminded her of the attic, but with the added terror of potential discovery at sea. If slave catchers boarded the ship, she would be found. If the captain decided the risk was too great, he could turn her over to authorities. If the ship encountered a storm, she might drown in her hiding place below the waterline. But luck and the captain's integrity held. The ship reached Philadelphia without incident, and Harriet stepped onto free soil for the first time in her life. She was 29 years old. She had spent a quarter of her life in a 9-by-7-foot crawl space. Her health was permanently damaged, but she was free. The years following Harriet's escape could fill another complete narrative. She eventually reunited with her children in New York. She became involved in the abolitionist movement. She worked as a domestic servant for families who came to know her story and supported her desire to share it publicly. And most importantly, she wrote her autobiography. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was published in 1861, and it represented something unprecedented in American literature. A first-person account by an enslaved woman that directly addressed the sexual violence and harassment that thousands of women had endured in silence. Harriet wrote under the pseudonym Linda Brent and changed the names of the people in her story to protect those who had helped her. But the events she described were entirely true. The book's publication caused controversy. Some readers doubted that the story could be real. Surely no woman would choose to spend 7 years in a crawlspace rather than submit to her master. Surely no doctor would pursue one escaped slave with such obsession. Surely Harriet was exaggerating for abolitionist propaganda purposes. But those who knew Harriet personally confirmed that every word was true. And later, historians would verify the details against public records, demonstrating that, if anything, Harriet had understated the horrors she endured. Dr. James Norcom died in 1850, 8 years after Harriet's escape, still bitter that she had eluded his control. He never knew that she had spent 7 years hidden within a few hundred yards of his house, so close that she could have walked there in 10 minutes if she had been able to walk. He died believing that she had escaped to the north immediately after her disappearance, never suspecting the truth. Harriet Jacobs lived until 1897, dying in Washington, D.C., at the age of 84. She had spent decades working for the rights of freed slaves, establishing schools, and advocating for women who had suffered the same sexual violence that she had endured. Her autobiography had influenced the abolitionist movement and provided testimony about aspects of slavery that most white Americans preferred to ignore. She had survived not only slavery and sexual harassment, but 7 years of voluntary imprisonment that would have broken most people within months. The story of Harriet Jacobs forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about survival, choice, and resistance. What does it mean to say someone is free when their options are submission to rape or imprisonment in a space too small to stand in? How do we measure the courage required to choose 7 years of physical torture over sexual compliance? What does it tell us about the nature of slavery that a woman would rather watch her children through a peephole than accept her master's demands? Modern readers sometimes struggle with the moral complexity of Harriet's story. Her decision to engage in a sexual relationship with Samuel Sawyer troubles those who want their heroes to be uncomplicated victims. The fact that she deliberately became pregnant as a strategy to protect herself makes some uncomfortable. The 7 years in the attic seem like such an extreme choice that readers question whether other options might have existed. But these reactions miss the central truth of Harriet's experience. She had no good options. Every choice available to her was terrible. The question was not whether she would suffer, but what form her suffering would take, and whether it would accomplish anything beyond her own destruction. She chose the form of suffering that preserved her agency, that protected her children, and that allowed her to eventually tell her story. The crawl space where Harriet hid no longer exists. Molly Hornablow's house has been torn down, and modern buildings occupy the site. But the staircase from Dr. Norcom's house where he assaulted Harriet has been preserved into the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Visitors can see the actual steps where a 15-year-old girl was beaten for refusing her master's sexual advances. They can stand in the place where history was made through violence and resistance. Harriet's autobiography continues to be read and studied, appearing on syllabi in universities across the country. Her story has influenced how Americans understand slavery, particularly the ways that enslaved women navigated sexual violence and protected their families. Historians have used her testimony to illuminate aspects of slavery that were long ignored or minimized in popular narratives. The power of Harriet Jacobs' story lies not in any simple message about triumph or redemption, but in its unflinching honesty about the choices that slavery forced upon its victims. She did not pretend that her decisions were easy or that her suffering made her noble. She wrote about her anger, her despair, her moments of weakness when she considered giving up. She described the psychological damage that 7 years of isolation inflicted. She acknowledged the ways that slavery had forced her to make choices that violated her own moral code. But she also insisted that even under the most oppressive conditions imaginable, human beings retain agency. Harriet could not prevent Dr. Norcom from building his cottage or making his threats. She could not change the law that classified her as property. She could not protect herself from Maria Norcom's violence or from the general brutality of slavery. But she could choose how to respond to these things. And she chose resistance. The resistance took many forms. It began with her refusal to submit to Dr. Norcom's harassment, despite years of psychological torture. It continued with her strategic decision to become pregnant by Samuel Sawyer, a choice that bought her children protection, even as it brought her social condemnation. It intensified with her decision to escape, and then to hide in a place where she knew the cost would be extreme. And it culminated in her decision to write her story and publish it for a nation that would rather not hear about the sexual violence that undergirded slavery. Each of these choices involved sacrifice and suffering. None of them were heroic in the simple sense, but collectively, they represented a sustained campaign of resistance against a system designed to eliminate all resistance. And that makes them remarkable. When we read Harriet Jacobs' story today, we see a woman who understood that slavery was not only about physical bondage, but about psychological control. Dr. Norcom wanted to break her spirit, to make her accept that submission was inevitable. The 7 years in the attic were Harriet's answer to that demand. She would rather destroy her body than surrender her sense of self. She would rather spend her life in darkness than live in the light as the creature Norcom wanted her to become. Modern psychologists would likely diagnose Harriet with severe PTSD by the time she escaped. She exhibited symptoms: hypervigilance, flashbacks, difficulty with trust, periods of depression, that she documented in her autobiography and that friends confirmed in letters and testimonies. The trauma of slavery, combined with 7 years of self-imposed isolation, left psychological scars that never fully healed. But trauma does not define a person's entire existence. Harriet Jacobs also demonstrated remarkable resilience, intellectual capacity, and moral courage. She taught herself to read and write at a level that allowed her to produce one of the most important pieces of American literature. She maintained relationships with her children despite years of separation. She found purpose in advocacy work that helped others escape slavery and build lives in freedom. She refused to let her suffering become her entire identity. The question of why Harriet's story was nearly lost to history for over a century reveals important truths about which stories American culture chooses to preserve. For decades after the Civil War, narratives about slavery focused almost exclusively on male experiences, on field labor, on physical brutality, on armed rebellion, on escape through the Underground Railroad. The specific forms of oppression that enslaved women endured, particularly sexual violence, were treated as shameful secrets that polite society did not discuss. Harriet's autobiography was dismissed by early 20th century historians as abolitionist propaganda, or even as fiction written by someone else and falsely attributed to an enslaved woman. The idea that a black woman could produce such sophisticated prose seemed impossible to scholars who had internalized racist assumptions about intellectual capacity. The idea that a woman would write publicly about sexual harassment and her own pregnancy outside of marriage seemed impossible to Victorian sensibilities that demanded female purity narratives. It was not until 1981, when historian Jean Fagan Yellin published her research verifying every claim in Harriet's autobiography, that incidents in the life of a slave girl was finally recognized as authentic testimony rather than propaganda. Yellin's work demonstrated that Harriet had not exaggerated or invented. If anything, she had understated her suffering to make her story more palatable to 19th century readers. This authentication sparked renewed interest in Harriet's story and led to broader recognition of sexual violence, central feature of slavery rather than an embarrassing side note. Historians began examining plantation records and finding extensive evidence that enslaved women were systematically subjected to rape and sexual coercion, that their children were often sold to eliminate evidence of white paternity, and that enslaved women developed various resistance strategies to protect themselves and their families. Harriet Jacobs' story became a touchstone for this scholarship, providing detailed first-person testimony about dynamics that had been hidden or minimized. Her description of how Dr. Norcom isolated her from her grandmother, how Maria Norcom punished her for her husband's desire, how she strategically became pregnant with another man's child. These accounts illuminated the complex ways that enslaved women navigated impossible situations. The story also contributed to broader conversations about consent, agency, and survival. When is a sexual relationship truly chosen rather than coerced? What does freedom mean when all available options involve suffering? How do we understand resistance that does not look like armed rebellion, but instead takes the form of strategic choices within oppressive constraints? These questions remain relevant today, extending beyond the specific historical context of slavery. Survivors of domestic violence, sexual trafficking, workplace harassment, and other forms of coercion face similar questions about choice and agency. Harriet's story provides no simple answers, but it offers testimony that sometimes survival requires choices that observers might judge harshly, and that the only people qualified to judge those choices are those who have faced similar circumstances. The physical space where Harriet hid has become a symbol for the various ways that survival can require isolation. The crawlspace represents not only Harriet's specific experience, but broader truths about how oppressed people sometimes protect themselves through withdrawal, psychological, emotional, or physical. It represents the cost of resistance, the ways that protecting one's core self can require sacrificing connection with the world. But the peephole represents something equally important: the maintenance of connection, even in isolation. Harriet did not simply hide for 7 years. She watched. She observed. She maintained her connection to her children and her community, even when she could not participate in their lives directly. She read newspapers and followed political developments. She kept her mind active and her spirit engaged even when her body was imprisoned. This combination of isolation and connection, of strategic retreat and continued engagement, offers lessons that extend far beyond Harriet's specific situation. Sometimes, survival requires creating boundaries that appear to cut us off from the world. Sometimes, protection requires hiding in spaces too small to contain our full selves. But survival also requires maintaining threads of connection, small openings that allow light to enter and allow us to see the world we hope to someday rejoin. Harriet eventually did rejoin that world. The 7 years in the crawl space did not define her entire existence, though they certainly shaped it. She went on to live a life of purpose and advocacy, to write her story and influence history, to raise children who grew up free, to build relationships and community. The attic was not the end of her story, though it was certainly a central chapter. When Harriet died in 1897, obituaries focused on her work with freed slaves and her contributions to education. Most readers had no idea that she was the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, because the book had fallen into obscurity and its pseudonymous authorship confused people about its origins. It would be another century before her story received the recognition it deserved. Today, Harriet Jacobs is recognized as one of the most important voices in American literature and one of the most eloquent witnesses to slavery's horrors. Her story is taught in schools, studied by scholars, and cited in discussions about trauma, survival, and resistance. The crawlspace that once imprisoned her body has become a powerful symbol of the lengths to which human beings will go to preserve their dignity and protect those they love. The choice Harriet made, to spend 7 years in a space barely larger than a coffin rather than submit to sexual violence, stands as testimony to the fundamental human need for autonomy. It declares that some things matter more than physical comfort, more than safety, more than survival itself. It insists that the right to say no to violations of one's body is worth any price. This is not a comfortable message for modern audiences who want to believe that survival is always the highest good and that submission is always preferable to suffering. Harriet's story challenges us to consider whether there might be circumstances where enduring torture is a more authentic form of resistance than acceptance, where choosing how one suffers is itself an exercise of freedom. The story also reminds us that trauma and triumph can coexist in a single life. Harriet never fully recovered from the physical damage caused by 7 years in the crawlspace. She lived with chronic pain and health problems for the remaining 55 years of her life. But she also accomplished remarkable things, writing a groundbreaking autobiography, raising free children, contributing to the abolitionist cause, establishing schools, and influencing how generations of Americans understood slavery. We do not need to choose between acknowledging the trauma and celebrating the triumph. Both are true. Harriet was damaged by what she endured, and she was also remarkably strong and resilient. She suffered enormously, and she also achieved great things. These truths do not cancel each other out. They coexist as part of a complex human experience that defies simple narratives. The legacy of Harriet Jacobs extends beyond her individual story to influence how we understand survival, resistance, and the long-term effects of oppression. Her testimony provides evidence that human dignity can survive circumstances designed to destroy it, that agency can exist even within the most constrained circumstances, and that the choices people make under oppression deserve respect rather than judgment from those who have never faced similar circumstances. Her story also stands as an indictment of systems that force people into impossible choices. The fact that Harriet had to choose between sexual submission and 7 years in a crawlspace is not a testament to her strength. It is a testament to slavery's cruelty. The fact that she survived that choice is remarkable, but we should never lose sight of the fact that she never should have been forced to make it. As we reflect on Harriet Jacobs' life today, we honor her not only for surviving, but for insisting that her story be told. She could have remained silent, could have focused only on rebuilding her own life after escape. Instead, she chose to write about experiences that 19th century society considered too shameful for public discussion. She chose to testify about sexual violence at a time when victims were blamed rather than supported. She chose to claim authorship of her own narrative when many people doubted that Black women were capable of literary production. These choices required a different kind of courage than the courage needed to hide in the crawl space. They required willingness to be judged, to be disbelieved, to be condemned by readers who thought she should have submitted to Dr. Norcom rather than engaging in a relationship with Samuel Sawyer. They required persistence in the face of skepticism about whether her story was even true. But Harriet understood that her individual survival was not enough. If her suffering was to have meaning beyond her own life, she needed to use it to illuminate the broader system that had caused it. She needed to testify not only about what had happened to her, but about what happened to thousands of other enslaved women whose stories would never be told. She needed to ensure that future generations understood not just the abstract horror of slavery, but the specific, intimate ways it violated human dignity. That testimony remains powerful today. When we read incidents in the life of a slave girl, we encounter not a distant historical figure, but a woman whose voice speaks directly to us across the centuries. We hear her anger, her determination, her despair, and her hope. We understand that slavery was not only about economic exploitation, but about psychological torture and sexual violence. We recognize that resistance took many forms, some of which appeared to be submission, but were actually strategic choices within impossible constraints. And we are reminded that in the struggle for human dignity, the most important victories are sometimes the private ones. The decision to refuse submission, even at tremendous cost. The choice to maintain one's sense of self, even in circumstances designed to destroy it. The determination to survive not just physically, but psychologically and spiritually. Harriet Jacobs spent 7 years in a crawl space barely larger than a coffin. But she also spent those 7 years refusing to become what Dr. James Norcom wanted her to be. And in the end, that refusal mattered more than all the suffering it cost her. It mattered to her children, who grew up free. It mattered to the thousands of readers who learned from her testimony. And it matters still to everyone who struggles to maintain dignity in circumstances that seem designed to destroy it. The hole in the wall was barely 1 inch square, but through it, Harriet Jacobs could see everything that mattered. Her children growing up free, the world continuing beyond her prison, and the future she was purchasing with years of her own life. That vision sustained her through 7 years of darkness. And when she finally emerged, she carried that vision forward into a life of purpose and advocacy that changed American history. This is not a story with a simple moral or an easy ending. It is a story about impossible choices, about the cost of resistance, about trauma and survival, and the complex ways that human beings navigate oppression. It is Harriet Jacobs' story, told in her own words, preserved for us to hear and learn from and honor. And it is absolutely, verifiably, documentably true.